Hartford, 1841. Cold winter winds swept through the narrow streets, carrying with them the distant sound of horse-drawn carriages and church bells. The town was alive that evening, yet a quiet unease hung in the air, almost as if the earth itself knew a tragedy was about to unfold. Inside the grand Chamberlain estate, warm candlelight glimmered against the polished mahogany walls, and the heavy scent of rosewater floated through the hall. Guests whispered in excited tones, their voices mixing with the faint melodies of a string quartet playing softly in the corner. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, the wedding of Catherine Miller, a young woman whose beauty had captivated the town, and Thomas Chamberlain, heir to one of Hartford's wealthiest families. Catherine stood before the mirror in her bridal chamber, her trembling hands clasping the edge of the oak table as her maid laced the final ribbons of her ivory gown. Her face, pale but radiant, reflected a nervous mixture of joy and fear. Outside the door, laughter and clinking glasses carried from the reception hall, but she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling in her chest. Her heart raced faster than the music downstairs. Something, deep inside her, warned her that tonight would not end the way she had imagined. Down the corridor, Margaret Chamberlain, the groom's mother, stood silently, her sharp eyes fixed on Catherine's closed door. Her hands rested delicately on the carved banister, her fingers tapping softly, rhythmically, as if lost in thought. There was no trace of warmth in her expression, only a cold stillness that betrayed her true feelings. To the guests, she was the image of refinement and dignity, but inside her heart burned with envy and bitterness. Catherine, the poor seamstress's daughter, had stolen her son, her only son, and tonight Margaret intended to reclaim control of her family's legacy, no matter the cost. The reception hall was grand, draped in silk curtains and adorned with chandeliers that scattered golden light across polished floors. The scent of fresh lilies filled the room as guests raised their crystal glasses in toast after toast. Thomas, the groom, stood proudly beside Catherine, his arm draped around her waist, his smile wide and full of hope. He leaned down and whispered something in her ear, making her blush softly as she lowered her gaze. But from the far end of the hall, Margaret watched them, her lips curved into a polite smile that never reached her eyes. When the feast began, servants carried silver trays, laden with roasted pheasant, spiced apples, and sweet wines from Europe. Margaret sat quietly, her gloved hand resting on a delicate porcelain cup filled with a warm, fragrant brew. She turned slightly and beckoned the maid over, whispering instructions in a low, deliberate tone. Moments later, the same maid approached, Catherine offering her a special cup, a drink said to calm her nerves and ease the weight of the day. Catherine hesitated, glancing toward Thomas, who smiled reassuringly and nodded. She lifted the cup to her lips and took a small sip, unaware that in that very moment her fate had begun to seal itself. Outside, the snow began to fall, soft flakes settling on the window panes, painting the night in silence and serenity. But inside, the atmosphere thickened with tension, almost imperceptible, like a storm building on the horizon. Catherine laughed gently at one of Thomas's jokes, but her laughter seemed fragile, strained, as if her body knew something her mind could not yet comprehend. As the music swelled and the dancing began, Margaret moved gracefully among the guests, greeting each one with a perfectly rehearsed charm. No one would have suspected the quiet malice hidden beneath her calm demeanor. Her carefully orchestrated plan was unfolding seamlessly, each moment leading closer to the inevitable. Her gaze lingered on Catherine, studying every movement, every breath, as though she were savoring the slow unraveling of her rival's happiness. Hours passed, and the celebration grew louder, brighter and wilder. But within Catherine something began to change. It started with a faint dizziness, a subtle pressure behind her temples, then a sudden wave of heat that made her grip Thomas's arm for balance. He turned to her immediately, concern flashing across his face, but she forced a smile and insisted she was fine. Yet the world around her began to blur. The laughter, the music, the glittering lights, all melting into a dizzying haze. Margaret watched from across the room, her wine untouched, her face serene and unreadable. Her hand brushed against the edge of the table, her fingertips tapping lightly, steadily, as though marking the seconds until the poison would take its hold. She glanced briefly at the grandfather clock in the corner, the long brass pendulum swinging, steady and relentless, counting down to the moment she had been waiting for. Catherine excused herself from the dance floor and slipped into the hallway, her breaths shallow, her hands clutching at the folds of her gown. She stumbled slightly as she made her way toward the staircase, her vision swimming in waves of light and shadow. Behind her she could hear faint footsteps, quiet, deliberate. But when she turned, the hall was empty. A chill ran down her spine. Downstairs, the voices of the guests seemed distant now, muffled, like echoes from another world. Catherine pressed her hand against the cold wall, trying to steady herself, her pulse pounding violently in her ears. Something was wrong. She knew it now. The warmth spreading through her body was unnatural, heavy, suffocating. Her chest tightened as she tried to breathe deeply, but the air refused to fill her lungs. Just then, Thomas appeared at the end of the hall, his expression alarmed as he rushed toward her. "Catherine," he whispered urgently, holding her trembling shoulders. "What's happening? Are you unwell?" She tried to answer, but her lips parted without sound. Her vision darkened at the edges, the candlelight dimming into shadows. Somewhere nearby, footsteps approached softly, slowly, and Catherine knew without seeing who it was. Margaret emerged from the darkness, her face calm and composed, her eyes reflecting the cold flicker of the candle flames. She placed a delicate hand on Catherine's arm, her voice smooth and measured. "Darling," she said softly, "you must rest. It's only the excitement, nothing more." But there was something in her tone, something chilling, final, and Catherine's breath caught in her throat. For a brief, fleeting moment, time seemed to stop. The music from the hall faded into silence. The air hung heavy, motionless, as though the house itself held its breath. And somewhere, deep inside her, Catherine felt the first shadows of death curling around her heart. The distant toll of the church bells marked midnight, yet the celebration inside the Chamberlain estate showed no signs of slowing. The guests moved in a whirl of music and laughter, their silks and satins catching the candlelight as the violins played faster, louder. The air inside was warm and heavy with the mingling scents of wine and roses, yet beneath the surface of joy there was an undercurrent of something darker, a quiet storm, building unseen. Margaret Chamberlain stood near the edge of the hall, her posture impeccable, her gloved hands resting lightly on the back of an ornate chair. From the outside she appeared serene, the perfect image of a refined matriarch hosting her son's wedding. But behind her composed expression, her thoughts were tangled and restless, weaving through shadows she had carried for years. Her gaze never left Catherine. She watched every detail, the way the girl's cheeks flushed when Thomas whispered in her ear, the way her laughter drew the attention of nearly every man in the room, the way she moved through the crowd with a grace that Margaret found unbearable. It wasn't simply jealousy. It was something deeper, something older, a wound carved into Margaret's pride. The Chamberlains had ruled Hartford's social circles for decades. Their fortune, built on shipping and land, made them untouchable. Margaret had spent her entire life preserving the family name, controlling every detail, every connection, every marriage. But Thomas had defied her. He had chosen Catherine, a woman with no wealth, No family of influence, no name worth speaking. A seamstress's daughter, a girl unworthy of the Chamberlain bloodline. Margaret's lips curved into a small, polite smile as one of the guests approached to compliment the decorations, but her mind was elsewhere. Her thoughts slipped back to the small glass vial hidden within her velvet purse upstairs. A single drop, that's all it would take. She had tested it weeks ago, carefully, patiently, on a stray dog she had found near the riverbank. The animal had grown weak within hours, its heartbeat slowing, its eyes turning glassy. Silent, painless, perfect. No one would suspect. No one would know. She sipped from her wine glass slowly, allowing the bitter liquid to linger on her tongue as she studied Catherine from across the room. The girl was radiant, yes, beautiful in a way that drew eyes wherever she went. But Margaret saw something else beneath the charm. Weakness, fragility, a heart too trusting, too naive. It almost angered her that Catherine had walked into this house, into her family, without even understanding the depth of the traditions she was about to destroy. Thomas approached Catherine with another glass of champagne, his smile soft, his voice gentle. Margaret could not hear what he whispered, but Catherine's laughter carried faintly through the air, warm and genuine. The sound struck Margaret like a blade. That laugh, so unguarded, so careless, it reminded her of someone else, long buried in the corners of her memory. Her jaw tightened as she turned her gaze away, hiding the flicker of emotion behind a perfectly rehearsed expression. No one could know. No one could suspect what she had planned. Meanwhile, Catherine's dizziness grew more persistent. At first, she had blamed the excitement, the endless toasts, the heat of the crowded room. But now, a dull pressure throbbed steadily behind her eyes, and her stomach churned as if unsettled by more than wine. She pressed a hand lightly against the edge of the table for balance, forcing herself to smile when one of the guests complimented her gown. Inside, her chest ached with an unfamiliar heaviness, but she brushed the thought away. It was just exhaustion. That's all it could be. Across the hall, a figure watched Catherine closely. Not Margaret this time, but Abigail, Thomas's younger sister. Barely 17, Abigail had always been fond of Catherine, seeing in her the sister she never had. But tonight, something about the bride seemed off. Her movements were slower, less fluid. Her laughter came in short bursts as though forced. Abigail frowned, taking a step toward her, but before she could approach, Margaret intercepted her, resting a delicate hand on her shoulder. "Enjoy the music, my dear," Margaret said softly, her tone warm but firm. "Your brother and his bride are fine. Leave them to their moment." Abigail hesitated, searching her stepmother's expression, but there was nothing there, no anger, no impatience, only the cool composure Margaret always carried. Reluctantly, she nodded and turned back toward the dance floor. But something in her chest tightened, a small knot of unease she couldn't explain. The string quartet shifted into a slower melody, the kind reserved for final dances and intimate goodbyes. Thomas pulled Catherine close, his hand resting gently at her waist as they moved together in measured steps. Her head leaned against his shoulder, her breaths shallow, her body lighter in his arms than it should have been. He whispered her name softly, but she didn't respond. Her eyelids fluttered as though the room around her was dissolving into shadows. Margaret stood only a few feet away now, her expression unreadable as she watched them. She moved gracefully toward the refreshment table, her hand brushing lightly against the edge of Catherine's untouched cup. The liquid within it glimmered faintly beneath the candlelight, innocent, inviting. She adjusted the placement slightly, as though ensuring the table looked perfect, and stepped back into the crowd. Minutes passed, and Catherine's condition worsened. She excused herself quietly from the dance floor, offering Thomas a faint smile to reassure him, though her lips trembled as she spoke. She slipped into one of the side corridors, away from the music and laughter, and pressed her back against the cool plaster wall. The sound of her heartbeat roared in her ears, each thud louder than the last. Her breaths came unevenly now, ragged, shallow. The silence of the hallway offered no comfort, only darkness, stretching endlessly ahead. Somewhere behind her, footsteps echoed softly on the polished wood floor. Catherine turned, expecting to see Thomas, but instead found Margaret standing at the far end of the corridor, her silhouette framed by the flickering candlelight. Her figure was poised, elegant, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Are you unwell, dear?" Margaret's tone was gentle, soothing, but there was a weight beneath it, something Catherine couldn't name. "The evening has been long. Perhaps you've simply overexerted yourself." Catherine tried to answer, but the words caught in her throat. She nodded faintly instead, pushing away from the wall to steady herself. Margaret stepped closer, her movements slow, deliberate, like a predator circling prey. Her hand brushed Catherine's arm lightly, almost tenderly, though her eyes remained cold and unyielding. "You should rest," she murmured, leaning closer so only Catherine could hear. "Sometimes, my dear, the body simply knows when it has reached its limit." The words sent an inexplicable chill down Catherine's spine. She wanted to move, to step back, but her body refused to obey. Her skin burned hot, her knees trembled beneath the weight of her gown, and her vision swam with waves of light and shadow. For a moment, she thought she saw something in Margaret's expression. A flicker of satisfaction, so brief it vanished before she could be sure. Back in the hall, the music slowed again, and Thomas began to notice Catherine's absence. He excused himself quickly from the group of guests surrounding him, scanning the room for any sign of her. When he couldn't find her, his chest tightened with worry, and he moved swiftly toward the corridor. Margaret turned at the sound of his footsteps, her composed mask firmly back in place. "She's unwell," she said softly as Thomas approached. "Perhaps the wine was too strong. I've suggested she lie down for a moment." Thomas frowned, his hand resting gently against Catherine's back. She leaned into him instinctively, her breath shaky, her eyes half-lidded. Without hesitation, he guided her toward the staircase, determined to take her somewhere quiet, where she could recover. Margaret followed behind them at a measured pace, her expression calm, her mind calculating. Every detail of the night was unfolding exactly as she had planned. But what Margaret didn't notice, what she couldn't have known, was that Abigail had followed too, silent and watchful. From the shadows of the staircase, the young girl's wide eyes tracked every movement, every glance, every word. And though she didn't yet understand the full extent of what was happening, a terrible thought had begun to form in her mind. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. The house had grown quieter now, though the faint hum of distant music still drifted up the grand staircase. Most of the guests remained below, their laughter spilling faintly through the marble halls. But the upper floor of the Chamberlain estate felt like an entirely different world, colder, heavier, suffused with an unnatural stillness. Catherine sat on the edge of the carved four-poster bed, her breath shallow, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. The soft glow of a single oil lamp cast long, uneven shadows across the walls, turning the corners of the room into pools of darkness. Thomas knelt before her, holding her trembling hands in his own. "Catherine," he whispered gently, searching her pale face, "you're shaking. Tell me what's wrong." Her lips parted as though to speak, but no sound came. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself, but the dizziness rolled through her again, stronger this time, like waves dragging her under. Her vision blurred, the edges of the room dissolving into shadow. I I just need to rest." She managed to whisper, her voice fragile and broken. "It's the excitement, that's all." From the doorway, Margaret stepped forward slowly, her silk gown rustling softly against the polished floor. Her expression was serene, composed, far too composed. She carried a small porcelain cup in her gloved hand, steam rising faintly from the surface of the liquid within. "I had cook prepare this for you," she said softly, her tone smooth and soothing, though her gaze remained steady, unblinking. "A calming tonic. Just a sip, darling. It will ease your nerves." Thomas turned toward his mother, gratitude in his expression, but Catherine hesitated. Something about Margaret's unwavering stare unsettled her, though she couldn't explain why. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the faint creak of the bed beneath her. Margaret stepped closer, placing the cup carefully into Catherine's trembling hands. Her gloved fingers lingered just slightly against Catherine's skin, a delicate, deliberate touch, before pulling away. "Drink," she whispered gently. "It will help you." Catherine lifted the cup, her hands trembling so violently that the liquid rippled against the porcelain. The smell was sweet, faintly floral, inviting. She hesitated, glancing at Thomas, who gave her an encouraging nod. Finally, she took a small sip. The warmth slid down her throat, almost comforting. But beneath the sweetness, there was a strange, bitter aftertaste that she couldn't ignore. Margaret's gaze remained fixed on her, watching, waiting. Within minutes, a strange sensation spread through Catherine's body, subtle at first, like the weight of sleep pressing gently against her shoulders. But then the heaviness deepened, curling around her chest, constricting her lungs with an invisible hand. Her heartbeat thudded violently in her ears, faster and louder, until she could hear nothing else. Thomas noticed the change immediately. "Catherine." His voice trembled slightly as he brushed a strand of damp hair from her forehead. "You're pale, colder than before." Margaret stepped forward again, her tone deceptively calm. "She needs to lie down. The day has been overwhelming." Thomas helped Catherine ease back onto the pillows, his worry growing with each passing second. He touched her wrist, feeling her racing pulse beneath fragile skin, but he forced himself to remain composed for her sake. "I'll send for a physician," he said firmly, turning toward the door. "No," Margaret interrupted quickly, too quickly, before softening her voice. "There's no need to alarm the guests. The doctor is unnecessary. Rest is what she needs." Thomas frowned, surprised by his mother's insistence. But before he could respond, Catherine's weak voice cut through the tension. "Please," she whispered, barely audible. "Don't leave me." He returned immediately to her side, his hand clutching hers tightly. The oil lamp flickered against the walls, throwing long, crooked shadows across the ceiling. Outside, a cold wind howled softly against the windows, rattling the glass. The once celebratory night now felt suffocating, heavy with dread. Downstairs, the celebration continued, oblivious to the unfolding tragedy above. But not everyone remained distracted. Abigail lingered near the base of the staircase, her hands clutching the polished railing as she stared upward into the shadows. She had seen Margaret carry the cup upstairs. She had seen the strange urgency in her step, the way her eyes followed Catherine. Something inside Abigail, instinct perhaps, told her that her stepmother's intentions were not as kind as they appeared. She took a deep breath and climbed the staircase quietly, each step careful, deliberate, as though she feared the house itself might hear her. When she reached the upper hall, she paused just outside Catherine's chamber, pressing her ear gently against the carved oak door. Inside, she could hear muffled voices, Thomas's concern, Margaret's soothing reassurances, and beneath, It all Catherine's faint, uneven breaths. Abigail pushed the door open just enough to see inside. Catherine lay still on the bed, her face pale and glistening with sweat, while Thomas sat beside her, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth. Margaret stood near the foot of the bed, her expression unreadable, her gloved hands clasped neatly before her. Abigail noticed the empty porcelain cup on the table and felt a cold shiver run through her. She stepped into the room quietly. "Is she all right?" she asked softly, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to sound composed. Thomas glanced up, nodding faintly. "She just needs rest," he said gently. "Mother's tonic will help her sleep." Abigail's gaze flicked toward Margaret, who smiled faintly, though her eyes remained cold and distant. "Yes," Margaret said softly. "She'll feel better soon." But Abigail wasn't convinced. Her gaze lingered on the cup, its faint floral scent still hanging in the air, sweet yet strangely bitter. She said nothing, only nodded. But deep inside her, unease grew like a shadow spreading silently across the floor. Hours passed, but Catherine's condition did not improve. If anything, it worsened. Her skin grew colder, her breathing shallow and uneven. Thomas refused to leave her side, his worry consuming him as the night stretched on endlessly. He whispered her name over and over, his voice breaking each time she failed to respond. Margaret remained in the room, composed and quiet, watching from her place near the window. She said little, offering only soft words of reassurance whenever. Thomas's panic began to rise, but inside, her thoughts were methodical, detached. She noted the way Catherine's body weakened, the way her color faded, just as expected. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. But then something unexpected happened. Catherine stirred suddenly, her eyes fluttering open for the briefest moment. Her gaze met Margaret's across the room, and in that instant, something passed between them. A realization, a silent understanding. Catherine's lips parted slightly, as though to speak, but no words came. Instead, a faint tremor ran through her, and she closed her eyes again. Margaret's composure faltered for the briefest second. A flash of doubt, or perhaps guilt, crossed her face, but it vanished as quickly as it came. She turned away from the bed, drawing the curtains closed against the winter night beyond the window. Abigail, watching quietly from the corner, noticed everything. The hesitation in Margaret's movements, the sharpness in her gaze whenever Thomas wasn't looking. The way she never drank from her own cup, never touched the food she offered Catherine. Abigail said nothing, not yet. But deep inside, a quiet determination began to take root. The Chamberlain estate, once filled with music and light, now seemed cloaked in silence and shadow. The celebration below had dwindled, guests departing. One by one, their laughter fading into the cold night air. Upstairs, the weight of dread pressed heavier with each passing minute, and somewhere within the walls of that grand, beautiful house, a secret was beginning to take shape, a truth buried beneath layers of civility and silence, waiting for the moment when it would claw its way to the surface. The poison had begun its work, and there would be no turning back. Dull, cold Hartford night had deepened, swallowing the streets outside the Chamberlain estate in silence. A thin veil of frost clung to the windows, and the once celebratory halls now echoed with an uneasy stillness. The laughter and music from the wedding had faded into memory. Most of the guests had gone, their carriages vanishing into the dark. Only a few lingered downstairs, their hushed voices carrying faintly through the grand stairwell. Upstairs, in the dimly lit bridal chamber, the air was heavy and suffocating. Catherine lay motionless on the bed, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Her face, once glowing with youth and life, had lost its color, replaced by a sickly pallor beneath the warm lamplight. Beads of sweat gathered along her temples, dampening the lace of her gown. Her trembling fingers clutched the bed sheets as though holding on to the very edge of consciousness. Thomas sat beside her, his shoulders tense, his expression carved with exhaustion and fear. His hands hovered helplessly over hers, wanting to comfort her yet unable to ease her suffering. "Catherine," he whispered softly, his voice breaking. "Please, stay with me." Her eyelids fluttered open weakly, revealing glassy eyes dulled by fatigue. She tried to speak, but only a faint sound escaped her lips. A breath, a whisper, without words. "Enough." Margaret's voice came from the corner of the room, calm and measured as always. She stepped closer, her silk gown whispering softly against the polished wooden floor. "She needs rest. You're overwhelming her, Thomas." Thomas turned sharply toward her, frustration cracking through his composure. "Rest? She can barely breathe, Mother. Something is wrong. This isn't exhaustion. This is something else entirely." Margaret's expression did not change. Her eyes, cold and unwavering, fixed on her son's panicked face. "The day has been long, the excitement overwhelming. You underestimate how fragile the body can be under such strain," she said smoothly, her voice carrying the weight of quiet authority. "She'll recover by morning." But Thomas wasn't convinced. He rose abruptly, running a hand through his disheveled hair, pacing near the bedside. "I'm sending for a physician," he said firmly. "You will do no such thing." Margaret's tone sharpened for just a fraction of a second before softening again. "Think of the guests, the rumors. A Chamberlain scandal on the night of your wedding. Do you want whispers filling Hartford streets by morning?" Thomas hesitated, torn between his mother's icy logic and the undeniable fear gnawing at his chest. He glanced back at Catherine, her weak form trembling beneath the sheets, and his heart clenched. "I don't care about whispers," he muttered. "I care about her." From the doorway, Abigail watched silently, her small frame nearly hidden in the shadows. She had crept closer without drawing attention, careful not to draw Margaret's gaze. Her wide, frightened eyes studied Catherine's condition, but her focus shifted quickly to the porcelain cup on the table, the same cup she had seen Margaret hand to Catherine hours ago. Abigail's suspicions had been growing since the start of the night, but now they solidified into something heavier: dread. She stepped into the room hesitantly, her voice soft but steady. "Thomas, maybe she doesn't just need rest," she said cautiously. "What if it's the drink she was given?" Thomas looked at her sharply, confusion flickering across his face. Margaret turned her head slowly, her gaze locking onto Abigail's with chilling precision. "Mind your tongue, child," she said softly, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Do not speak of things you do not understand." Abigail flinched slightly but did not retreat. Her instincts screamed louder than her fear now, and though she dared not accuse Margaret outright, her eyes drifted meaningfully back to the cup. Thomas followed her gaze, and for the first time, doubt entered his mind. Catherine stirred faintly on the bed, her hand twitching as though reaching for something. "Unseen." Thomas returned to her side immediately, holding her delicate fingers in his trembling grasp. "I'm here," he whispered desperately, leaning close so she could hear him. "I'm right here, Catherine." Her lips parted slightly, her breath uneven as a faint broken sound escaped. His name. Thomas's throat tightened. He turned back to Margaret, his voice rising with raw urgency. "If she doesn't improve in the next hour, I'm sending for the doctor whether you approve or not." Margaret's expression remained calm, but her hands, clasped neatly before her, tightened imperceptibly. Her voice was soft, almost soothing as she replied, "Do what you feel is necessary, Thomas, but panic will not save her." The words were carefully chosen, but Abigail noticed the flicker in Margaret's eyes, a fleeting shadow of something colder, sharper. She filed it away silently, her unease deepening. As the night dragged on, Catherine's symptoms worsened. The faint dizziness had evolved into relentless waves of nausea, her breathing shallow and labored, her skin damp and clammy to the touch. Every so often, her body jerked slightly, subtle tremors rippling beneath the delicate lace of her gown. The room, thick with heat and the faint scent of roses, felt oppressive, suffocating. Thomas stayed beside her, refusing to move even when the clock struck past 2. His once celebratory wedding attire was now wrinkled, his face pale with exhaustion and fear. He wiped Catherine's forehead with a damp cloth over and over, whispering reassurances she was too weak to hear. Abigail sat silently in the corner, her knees drawn up, watching Margaret with careful, deliberate attention. She noticed how her stepmother's face remained unnaturally composed, untouched by panic, as though she already knew the outcome. And that composure, that cold, unyielding calm, terrified her. Suddenly, Catherine let out a sharp, strangled gasp, her back arching slightly before she collapsed deeper into the pillows. Thomas froze, his blood running cold as he grabbed her shoulders, shaking her gently. "Catherine, stay with me, please. Stay with me." Margaret moved closer, resting a gloved hand lightly on Thomas's arm. "Thomas," she said quietly, "you must calm yourself. You're frightening her." But Thomas shoved her hand away, his grief boiling into anger. "Don't tell me to calm down." His voice cracked as he turned on her, his face pale with desperation. "Something is wrong, Mother. Something is killing her. And you want me to sit here and do nothing?" For the first time that night, Margaret's composure faltered slightly. A flicker, so quick it was almost imperceptible, crossed her face before she regained control. "Then send for the physician," she said softly, stepping back. "Do whatever you must." Thomas turned immediately to Abigail. "Go," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. "Find Dr. Whittaker now." Abigail ran from the room, her footsteps echoing down the silent hall, but not before casting one last glance at Margaret. And in that glance, a silent war began. Suspicion meeting secrecy, innocence clashing with something far darker. Margaret turned back toward the bed, her face once more an unreadable mask. She stood at the foot of the bed, her hands clasped, neatly before her, watching Catherine's weak, trembling breaths. The sound of Thomas's ragged whispers filled the heavy silence. Outside, the wind howled violently against the walls of the estate, rattling the windows and creaking the wooden beams. Somewhere deep within the house, the grandfather clock struck 3, its hollow chimes reverberating like distant thunder. And in that moment, as Catherine lay pale and motionless beneath the canopy of her wedding bed, a terrible truth settled quietly over the room, though no one dared to speak it aloud. This was no ordinary illness. Something unnatural was happening, and the night was far from over. The sharp, hollow sound of carriage wheels cutting through frozen ground shattered the silence outside the Chamberlain estate. The night had grown heavier, the frost thicker, and an unsettling quiet hung in the air, broken only by the occasional creak of the mansion's ancient beams. Inside the grand halls, whispers had turned into silence. Even the servants had retreated into corners, terrified of the growing tension surrounding the newlywed bride's mysterious illness. At long last, hurried footsteps echoed up the staircase. Abigail, breathless and pale, emerged with Dr. Jonathan Whittaker following close behind her. A man of 50, stocky and weathered, with keen grey eyes that missed nothing, Dr. Whittaker had delivered half of Hartford's children and buried just as many. He carried his worn leather satchel tightly, his expression carved with professional restraint, but his pace was quick. Thomas nearly stumbled toward him the moment he entered the room. "Doctor, thank God you're here." His voice was hoarse from hours of pleading with Catherine to stay conscious. Whitaker removed his gloves briskly, nodding toward the bedside. "Step aside, Thomas," he said firmly, but not unkindly. "Let me see her." Catherine lay still beneath the heavy lace canopy, her body dwarfed by the vast bed. Her breaths were shallow, her skin damp and ghostly pale. The once bright glow of her wedding night had drained away, leaving only the hollow shell of a young woman fighting for life. The doctor bent close, checking her pulse, examining her pupils. Under the lamplight, his brows knitting tightly as his hand rested briefly against her fevered skin. "How long has she been like this?" he asked without looking up. Thomas swallowed hard. "It started after she had something to drink hours ago. She complained of dizziness, then nausea, and now—" He stopped, his voice cracking, unable to finish. Margaret, standing near the fireplace with perfect composure, answered instead, her tone smooth and steady. "The excitement of the day overwhelmed her, doctor. Nothing more. She simply needs rest." Whitaker glanced at her briefly, his expression unreadable, then returned his attention to Catherine. "This isn't exhaustion," he said quietly but firmly. "Her pulse is faint, her pupils are unresponsive, and her breathing—" He leaned close, listening to the irregular rhythm of her lungs before straightening, his face tense. "Her breathing is compromised." Thomas's voice broke as he stepped forward. "Tell me she'll be all right." The doctor didn't answer immediately. He opened his satchel, pulling out small vials, cloths, and instruments, carefully placing them on the table beside the bed. "I'll do everything I can," he said at last, his voice low, "but I need to know exactly what she consumed." Abigail froze, her eyes darting toward the porcelain cup still sitting on the bedside table. Untouched since Catherine's last sip hours ago. Before she could speak, Margaret stepped forward smoothly, lifting the cup with delicate precision. "Just a restorative tonic," she said calmly. "I prepared it myself to soothe her nerves." Whitaker turned sharply, his gaze settling on Margaret with quiet scrutiny. "Then I'll need to examine what's left of it," he said, reaching out his hand. Margaret hesitated for the briefest fraction of a second, barely perceptible, but Abigail noticed. At last, she offered the cup without protest, her face an unreadable mask. Whitaker sniffed the contents, swirling the faint residue against the porcelain, then dipped a small strip of paper into the liquid. He watched as the edge of the strip darkened instantly, his expression tightening. "This tonic," he murmured, his voice quiet but edged with suspicion. "What's in it?" Margaret tilted her head slightly, her tone sharp, yet controlled. "Laudanum. Just a few drops, doctor. Entirely harmless in small amounts." Whitaker's jaw clenched. "Laudanum is opium, Mrs. Chamberlain. It is not harmless, especially for someone of Catherine's size." He turned to Thomas, his voice urgent now. "Did you know she was given this?" Thomas looked between them, stunned, his voice trembling. No, I didn't. I didn't know." The tension thickened, suffocating. Abigail, clutching her hands tightly in front of her, stepped forward hesitantly. "Doctor, forgive me, but it didn't smell like laudanum earlier," she said softly. "It smelled bitter, different." Margaret's gaze snapped toward her, cold and sharp, but Whitaker's attention was fixed entirely on Catherine. "We're wasting time," he muttered, rolling up his sleeves. "We need to purge her system before whatever she consumed takes full hold." Thomas nodded rapidly. "Do whatever you have to. Please, save her." For the next hour, the room became a silent battlefield. Whitaker administered remedies, placing cold compresses against Catherine's skin, forcing her to swallow small doses of neutralizing mixtures, monitoring every faint breath and twitch of her fingers. Abigail moved quickly under his instructions, fetching water, towels, and cloths without hesitation. Thomas hovered helplessly, whispering prayers he barely remembered, his fingers intertwined with Catherine's limp hand. Margaret remained perfectly still near the window, her face calm, her expression unreadable. Her silence was deafening. At one point, Whitaker looked up sharply from his work, his voice low but urgent. "She's showing signs of atropine poisoning." Thomas blinked in confusion. "What does that mean?" "It means," the doctor said grimly, "that if I don't stabilize her soon, she won't survive the night." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Thomas staggered back, his hand gripping the edge of the bed for support as the blood drained from his face. Abigail froze where she stood, her breath caught in her throat. Margaret finally spoke, her voice calm and detached. "Surely you're mistaken, Doctor. Atropine poisoning? That's absurd." Whitaker fixed her with a piercing look. "Absurd or not, these are her symptoms. Bitter taste, dilated pupils, failing heartbeat. Something toxic is in her system, whether intentional or not." Abigail glanced at Margaret sharply, but Thomas didn't seem to notice. He was on his knees now, his forehead pressed against Catherine's hand, silent tears streaking down his face. Minutes stretched into agonizing hours as Whitaker fought to stabilize her fragile body. Every so often, Catherine stirred faintly, her lips moving without sound, her skin growing colder beneath Thomas's desperate touch. Finally, just before dawn, her breathing evened slightly. Not normal, but steadier, less ragged. Whitaker sank into the chair, wiping his brow. "She's not out of danger," he said softly, "but for now, she's holding on." Thomas exhaled shakily, gripping the doctor's hand in silent gratitude before collapsing into the chair beside Catherine. But even in this fragile moment of hope, Abigail's gaze shifted to Margaret, who stood unmoving, her hands clasped tightly together, her jaw clenched hard enough that a faint tremor ran along her cheek. It was the first crack in her otherwise perfect composure. Abigail filed it away silently, her suspicions growing heavier by the second. Something terrible had happened here, and she was going to uncover it. Down the hall, the grandfather clock struck 5, its hollow chimes carrying through the dark estate. Morning was near, but the night's horrors were far from over, because Catherine was still dying and Margaret Chamberlain was still watching. The first light of dawn crept through the tall windows of the Chamberlain estate, but it brought no warmth, no comfort. The golden rays spilling across the grand bedroom floor looked pale and lifeless, as though even the sun hesitated to touch this place. The entire house was silent, save for the ragged sound of Catherine's shallow breaths. Dr. Whitaker leaned against the edge of the bed, his brow furrowed as he examined Catherine again. Her skin had grown colder through the night despite the layers of blankets draped over her fragile body. Her lips were pale, her pupils wide and unresponsive to light. The faint rise and fall of her chest was all that tied her to the living. Thomas sat on the floor beside the bed, his back against the carved mahogany frame, his face buried in his trembling hands. His once celebratory clothes were wrinkled and damp with sweat, his hair disheveled, his voice hoarse from hours of pleading and praying. Every second felt heavier than the last. Abigail stood quietly in the far corner, watching everything. Her small frame was swallowed by the shadows, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. The way Margaret stood near the window, her posture rigid, yet composed. The way her gloved hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles whitened. The faint, fleeting glances she cast toward the empty porcelain cup now resting on the doctor's table. Dr. Whitaker finally broke the silence, his voice low but urgent. "Thomas," he said softly, "her condition isn't improving the way I'd hoped. Whatever is in her system, it's potent." Thomas lifted his head slowly, his bloodshot eyes locking onto the doctor's face. You mean poison?" he whispered, his voice cracking on the word. Whitaker hesitated, glancing briefly at Margaret before speaking carefully. "I'm saying her symptoms are consistent with poisoning. Atropine, perhaps, or something similar. But without testing—" He trailed off, sighing heavily. Margaret's voice sliced through the tension like cold steel. "This is absurd," she said calmly, stepping forward. "You're grasping at shadows, Doctor. Perhaps it's simply a fever brought on by exhaustion and nerves. Catherine has always been delicate." Abigail's jaw tightened, her hands clasping the folds of her dress. She wanted to scream the truth aloud, to point at the cup, to accuse Margaret openly, but the weight of fear pinned her tongue. Whitaker's sharp gaze flicked toward Margaret. "Delicate or not, this isn't exhaustion," he said firmly. "I've treated fevers, Mrs. Chamberlain. This is different." Margaret's lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "And yet, Doctor," she murmured softly, "despite all your skill, you still haven't saved her." The jab hung heavy in the air, silencing everyone for a long moment. Thomas rose unsteadily to his feet, his chest heaving with barely contained emotion. "Mother," he said, his voice trembling but edged with steel, "if you know anything at all, that could help her, you need to tell me. Now." Margaret turned slowly to face him, her gaze sharp, unflinching. "I know nothing more than you do," she said evenly, though something in her voice carried a quiet finality, as if daring him to doubt her. Thomas's fists clenched at his sides, his breath uneven. He turned abruptly, placing his hand on Catherine's forehead, whispering brokenly, "She doesn't deserve this. She doesn't—" Abigail stepped closer to the doctor, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "The tonic," she whispered urgently. "It wasn't just laudanum. I'm certain of it. The smell, the bitterness. It was wrong." Whitaker's jaw tightened. He leaned slightly toward her, whispering back, "Do you still have any of it?" Abigail nodded subtly toward the porcelain cup on the table. "Only what's left there." The doctor's hand hovered over the cup but didn't touch it yet, his gaze sliding cautiously toward Margaret. Something about the icy calm on her face made his instincts flare. He stepped back quietly, sliding the cup into his satchel without a word. Margaret noticed, of course. Her sharp eyes followed every movement, but she said nothing. Not yet. The grandfather clock down the hall struck 7, its hollow chimes echoing faintly into the tense silence. Outside, the carriages of early Hartford traders clattered faintly over cobblestones, the sounds of a city waking to life. But inside the Chamberlain estate, time felt frozen, each tick of the clock suffocating in its weight. Catherine stirred faintly on the bed, her lips parting as a fragile, broken sound escaped. Thomas dropped to his knees immediately, leaning close to her. "Catherine, I'm here, love. I'm right here." Her glassy eyes fluttered open just enough to meet his, unfocused and distant. A whisper trembled from her lips, barely audible. "Bitter. So bitter." Thomas froze, the words slicing through him like a knife. Bitter. The drink. His head turned slowly, his gaze locking on Margaret. "You gave her the tonic," he said, his voice low, cold, trembling with restrained fury. Margaret's chin lifted, slightly, her composure flawless, though her voice was quiet. "Yes, to calm her nerves." "To calm her nerves," Thomas repeated softly, his voice cracking. "Or to kill her." The room went silent. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to quiet, its soft crackling drowned by the weight of the words. Abigail flinched at the accusation, her breath catching. Dr. Whitaker froze mid-motion, his sharp gaze darting between them, sensing the fragile edge between grief and chaos. Margaret, however, didn't flinch. Her expression remained unreadable, though her voice turned colder, smoother. "Be very careful with your words, Thomas," she said softly. "Grief can make you see enemies where there are none." Thomas stepped toward her, his fists clenched. "I don't need grief to see the truth," he said, his voice rising. "I see it in your eyes. You've hated her since the moment you met her." Margaret's voice sharpened, finally cracking the ice of her composure. "I hated what she took from you," she snapped, her voice ringing through the room. Then, almost immediately, her tone softened again, measured and calm. "But I would never harm her. Never." The denial hung in the air, but it felt hollow, fragile, as though even Margaret herself didn't believe it fully. Abigail's heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear anything else. Every instinct screamed at her. Margaret was hiding something. She just didn't have proof. "Not yet," Dr. Whitaker interrupted, his tone urgent, slicing through the rising storm. "This argument isn't saving her. If we don't stabilize her heartbeat within the hour, she won't survive." Thomas turned back to the bed instantly, kneeling beside Catherine again, tears streaking his cheeks. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please, stay with me." Whitaker moved quickly, preparing another mixture from his satchel, while Abigail brought fresh water and cloths. For long, agonizing minutes they worked in silence, the room heavy with tension and unspoken accusations. From the corner of her eye, Abigail noticed Margaret slip something small, metallic, back into the folds of her gown, her movements swift and practiced. She made no sound, drew no attention, but Abigail saw it. And she knew, with bone-deep certainty now, that Margaret wasn't just innocent of nothing. She was guilty of everything. Abigail didn't speak, not yet. She would wait, watch, gather, proof. Because this was no longer just about saving Catherine. It was about surviving Margaret Chamberlain, and the night was far from over. The Chamberlain estate had fallen into an eerie quiet. Outside, Hartford's morning had broken fully, but inside the sprawling mansion, time felt trapped in a darker hour, as though dawn itself had refused to enter. Abigail moved silently down the long hallway, the wooden floorboards creaking faintly beneath her slippers. Every step felt heavier, her heart pounding louder than the sound of her feet. She paused near the door to Margaret's private chambers, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the brass handle. She shouldn't be here. If Margaret caught her, the consequences would be severe. But Abigail couldn't ignore what she had seen, the subtle slip of a metallic vial into Margaret's gown, the calmness in her face when everyone else was panicking, the bitterness of Catherine's drink. Every instinct screamed at her. Margaret knew more than she admitted. Slowly, carefully, Abigail turned the handle and slipped inside. Margaret's room was immaculate, its order almost unnatural. Heavy velvet curtains blocked most of the daylight, and the faint scent of lavender oil hung in the air. Abigail's gaze swept across the dressing table, the neatly arranged perfumes, powders, and brushes. On the far side stood a tall mahogany cabinet, its doors slightly ajar. She approached cautiously, glancing over her shoulder before pushing the door open wider. Inside, shelves lined with glass bottles gleamed faintly in the dim light. Abigail's fingers hovered over them. Tinctures, tonics, and strange liquids she didn't recognize. Her breath caught when she found a small, ornate vial tucked behind a larger bottle, its silver stopper engraved with delicate floral patterns. Pulling it into the light, she noticed a faint residue clinging to the glass. She uncorked it carefully and recoiled instantly at the acrid, bitter scent. She didn't know the name for it, but something deep inside told her this was wrong. Dangerous. Suddenly, footsteps echoed faintly in the corridor outside. Abigail froze, her breath shallow, clutching the vial tightly. She slid it back into place, closed the cabinet, and ducked behind the heavy curtains just as the door creaked open. Margaret entered, her presence filling the room like a shadow swallowing light. She moved with deliberate grace, her silk gown whispering softly against the floorboards. Abigail dared not breathe as Margaret crossed to the vanity, removing her gloves with careful precision. Margaret stood silently for a long moment, staring into the mirror. Her reflection stared back, calm, composed, regal. Yet her jaw tightened, and a flicker of something sharp and dark crossed her face. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke to her own reflection. He was never supposed to marry her. Abigail's blood ran cold. Before Margaret could turn, Abigail slipped quietly out through the side passage, her body trembling as she leaned against the cold wall outside. Her suspicions weren't suspicions anymore. Margaret hated Catherine, and she wasn't sure anymore how far that hatred reached. Downstairs, Dr. Whittaker sat at the large oak table in the study, his satchel open before him. He carefully examined the residue from Catherine's cup under a small magnifying lens. He scraped a thin sample onto a cloth, then poured a reagent over it from a glass vial. Within seconds, the sample darkened into a deep, inky blue. Whittaker's jaw tightened. Atropine, he whispered under his breath. He knew now. There was no doubt anymore. Before he could collect his thoughts, Thomas entered the study, his eyes red and weary but blazing with desperation. "Tell me," Thomas demanded, his voice strained. "What did you find?" Whittaker hesitated, his lips parting and closing again. He glanced toward the door, lowering his voice. "Thomas, the drink Catherine consumed wasn't harmless. It contained atropine. A poison." Thomas stared at him, his chest heaving, his fists clenching tightly at his sides. "Poison," he repeated softly, as though testing the word on his tongue. Slowly, his expression hardened. "Who did this?" Whittaker hesitated. I don't know. But someone inside this house gave it to her." Thomas's gaze sharpened, his thoughts immediately spiraling back to the porcelain cup, to the person who had handed it to Catherine, Margaret. His breathing grew shallow, his anger hot and raw beneath the surface. But before he could say the name aloud, footsteps approached the study. Margaret entered, calm and elegant as ever, her hands clasped neatly before her. "Doctor," she said smoothly, ignoring Thomas's blazing stare. "I trust you're making progress." Whittaker stood slowly, his expression guarded. "I am, but I need absolute honesty from everyone in this household if I'm to save Catherine." Margaret tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. "And yet, you're already looking at me as though you found your culprit." Thomas's voice cracked like thunder. "Did you give her that drink, Mother?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Margaret's expression didn't waver. Her voice was calm, steady, chillingly composed. "I did. To soothe her nerves." Thomas stepped closer, his face inches from hers, his voice low and dangerous. "And you expect me to believe you didn't know what was in it?" Margaret's gaze hardened, her composure like steel. "If you are accusing me of harming her," she said softly, "say it plainly." Thomas's breath shook, his anger clawing for release, but Dr. Whittaker stepped between them quickly. "Enough," the doctor snapped. "Arguing won't save her. If we don't work together, Catherine will die." Margaret's eyes flickered briefly, a flash of something sharp, unreadable, before she turned without a word and swept from the room. Thomas stared after her, his jaw tight, his hands trembling violently. Abigail appeared in the doorway moments later, pale and shaken, clutching something small in her hand, the ornate vial she had stolen from Margaret's cabinet. She met Whittaker's gaze silently, and placed it into his palm. Whitaker examined the residue clinging to the glass and looked up, his expression grim. "This," he said softly, "is the proof we need." The rain began to fall outside, soft at first, then heavier, drumming against the tall windows of the Chamberlain estate. Inside, shadows stretched long across the wooden floors as the storm grew stronger, thunder rolling in the distance. It felt as if the heavens themselves mourned what was unfolding within these walls. Catherine's breathing had grown shallow, her pale lips trembling as if whispering prayers no one could hear. Abigail sat at her bedside, clutching a damp cloth, dabbing it gently against Catherine's fevered skin. Every few minutes her hand would shake, fear tightening around her chest like a vice. Dr. Whitaker stood nearby, his brows furrowed as he prepared a new mixture of herbs and tinctures, desperately fighting to keep Catherine alive. He set the small bottle aside and leaned closer, pressing 2 fingers to her wrist, his jaw tightening at the weak, irregular pulse. "She doesn't have much time," he murmured under his breath. Abigail glanced up, tears brimming in her eyes. "Can't you do something, Doctor?" "There must be something." Whitaker hesitated, his gaze falling briefly on the small, ornate vial resting on the table beside him. The same vial Abigail had stolen from Margaret's cabinet. "I can only do something," he said slowly, "if I know exactly how much." She was given. Without that, any antidote could kill her faster. Abigail swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "Then, we have to confront her. We have to make her tell us." In the study downstairs, Thomas paced back and forth before the roaring fireplace, his face pale, his jaw clenched. The storm outside howled louder now, and every flash of lightning illuminated his rage-stricken expression. He stopped abruptly when he heard the soft creak of the door opening behind him. Margaret entered, calm as ever, carrying a silver tray with 2 cups of tea. "You shouldn't be walking around in this weather," she said smoothly, placing the tray on the table. "You'll make yourself ill." Thomas turned sharply, his voice hoarse but laced with fury. "Stop pretending to care. You're the reason Catherine is dying." Margaret froze for the briefest moment, her hand lingering over the handle of the teapot. But then she looked up, her expression cold, collected, unyielding. "You believe Abigail's whispers now?" she asked softly. "That servant girl has always despised me." "This isn't Abigail," Thomas growled. "It's the vial. It's Whitaker's test. Atropine, poison, and the only person who had access to it is you." Margaret's lips parted slightly, but her expression never faltered. She stepped forward slowly, her voice low and deliberate. "I will forgive your words, Thomas. You are grieving. You are scared. But do not accuse me of something so vile." Thomas slammed his fist on the table, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. "Enough. If Catherine dies..." His voice cracked. "I will never forgive you." Margaret's gaze darkened, her composure slipping for the first time. She stared at her son, her voice sharp and icy. "You think I wanted this?" she whispered fiercely. "You think I wanted her gone? I only wanted to protect you." "Protect me?" Thomas barked, incredulous. "From what? From happiness? From love?" Margaret's jaw tightened. Her silence was louder than any words she could have spoken. Upstairs, Dr. Whitaker worked quickly in the small laboratory he had improvised from an empty chamber. Glass vials, metal instruments, and handwritten notes cluttered the table before him. He poured a droplet of liquid from Margaret's ornate vial onto a white scrap of linen, watching closely as the edges burned faintly at contact. He exhaled sharply. "Concentrated," he muttered under his breath. "Far too much for an accident." Before he could continue, the door creaked open and Abigail slipped inside, her face pale. "She refuses to confess," Abigail whispered, her voice trembling. "She just stands there lying as though none of this is real." Whitaker sighed, heavily wiping his brow. She won't confess. Not unless we make her. Abigail hesitated, staring at him. What are you suggesting? The doctor paused, his fingers drumming against the wooden table. There's a way, he said quietly, to prove she did this even without her words. If we test her tea, her powders, her vials, we'll find traces. But we'll need her cooperation, or a distraction. Abigail swallowed nervously. She'll never give it willingly. Whitaker's gaze hardened. Then we'll take it. Meanwhile, Catherine stirred faintly in her sleep, whispering something incomprehensible. Her lips barely moved, but Abigail caught one broken fragment when she leaned closer. Margaret. Abigail froze. Her heart skipped a beat, and her trembling hand clasped Catherine's more tightly. She knows. Abigail whispered to herself. Even now she knows. Downstairs, Thomas and Margaret sat across from each other in silence, the storm raging louder beyond the windows. Finally, Margaret broke the stillness, her voice sharp and deliberate. You think I'm your enemy, she said softly, but I've been saving you from yourself since the day you were born. Thomas frowned, his anger simmering beneath the surface. Explain yourself. Margaret leaned forward, her expression dark, her voice almost a hiss. Catherine is not who she pretends to be. Thomas stared at her, stunned. What are you talking about? She came here for your name, your fortune. Not your love, Margaret said, her eyes burning into his. She would have destroyed you. Thomas shook his head violently. No. No. You're twisting this. You always hated her because she wasn't from our world. Margaret rose abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. You think you know her, but you don't know the truth. Before Thomas could respond, the door to the study burst open and Dr. Whitaker entered, holding the ornate vial high in his hand. I know the truth, Whitaker said coldly, and it's in this glass. Margaret's eyes flicked to the vial, and for the first time her expression faltered, just slightly, but enough for Thomas to see it. Whitaker set the vial on the table with a soft thud, his gaze locked on Margaret. This was taken from your cabinet. It contains atropine, enough to kill a grown man, and traces of it are in Catherine's blood. Margaret's breath hitched almost imperceptibly. That doesn't prove I gave it to her. No, Whitaker agreed softly, his voice deadly calm. But it proves someone in this house meant for her to die. And you're running out of shadows to hide in. The storm outside roared louder, rattling the windows as if the house itself strained under the weight of secrets long buried. The storm outside had grown merciless. Rain battered the tall windows, and thunder cracked like a distant cannon fire, shaking the foundations of the Chamberlain estate. Inside, a heavy silence clung to every corridor, broken only by the faint groans of the house itself, as though the walls bore witness to sins too dark to speak aloud. Upstairs, Catherine lay motionless, her breaths shallow, ragged, and uneven. The pale light of the oil lamp cast her face in haunting relief, her skin waxy and drained of color. Abigail sat at her bedside holding her limp hand, her own tears silently falling onto the lace of Catherine's nightgown. Stay with us, Abigail whispered, her voice cracking. Please, don't leave us. Dr. Whitaker stood nearby. His sleeves rolled to his elbows, mixing another preparation in his small brass bowl. His movements were quick, precise, almost desperate, his jaw set tight as he crushed dried herbs and tinctures together. She's getting weaker, he muttered, under his breath. If we don't neutralize the poison soon, we'll lose her. Abigail swallowed hard, clutching Catherine's hand tighter. You said you found traces of atropine in her blood, she whispered. Then why can't you cure her? Whitaker paused, his gaze dropping briefly to the ornate vial resting on the table beside him. Because we don't know how much she was given, he said darkly. If I give her too little, it won't save her. If I give her too much, her heart will stop instantly. Before Abigail could respond, the door burst open. Thomas stormed in, his face pale but flushed with anger, his eyes wild with desperation. "How is she?" he demanded, his voice strained. Whitaker shook his head. "She's slipping away." Thomas staggered back slightly, gripping the edge of the dresser for balance. His chest rose and fell rapidly, as though he were drowning in his own helplessness. And then, without warning, Margaret appeared in the doorway, her expression calm, composed, unnervingly steady. "You're all wasting time," she said softly, her voice slicing through the room like a blade. "Catherine's condition won't improve unless we face the truth." Thomas turned on her instantly, his voice rising. "The truth? You're the reason she's dying." Margaret's eyes narrowed, her composure cracking for the first time. "And you're blind," she spat back, "blind to what she's done, blind to who she really is." Whitaker glanced between them, his frown deepening. "What are you talking about, Margaret?" Margaret's gaze flicked to Catherine's still form on the bed, and for a moment, something unspoken seemed to pass behind her eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or something darker still. She stepped further into the room, her voice low and deliberate. "She lied to you," Margaret said, looking directly at Thomas. "Catherine isn't who she claims to be." Thomas froze, his fists clenching. "Enough!" he hissed. "Stop twisting this. Stop trying to justify what you've done." But Margaret didn't back down. "Her name isn't even Catherine Whitmore," she said coldly. "That isn't her family. That isn't her lineage. She came into this house wearing a mask." Abigail stared at her, wide-eyed, whispering, "That's impossible." Margaret turned sharply toward her. "Is it? I warned him from the start, but no one listens to me, not when love clouds reason." Thomas shook his head violently, his voice breaking. "I don't believe you. You'd do anything to get rid of her." For the first time, Margaret's voice cracked slightly, the icy calmness faltering. "I was trying to protect this family," she whispered, "from her secrets." Whitaker stepped forward slowly, his hand resting on the ornate vial. "Secrets don't poison people, Margaret," he said coldly. "People do." Margaret's eyes flashed with fury, but before she could reply, Catherine stirred faintly on the bed, letting out a broken gasp. Everyone turned instantly. Abigail leaned forward, her heart racing. "Catherine, can you hear me?" Catherine's lips trembled, forming silent words, until finally, in a faint, cracked voice, she whispered, "Margaret knows." The entire room froze. Thomas's breath hitched sharply, his gaze snapping to his mother. "What does she know?" he demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. Margaret stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable, but deep within her eyes, there was something like terror hidden beneath her steel composure. Whitaker leaned over Catherine, speaking softly. "Catherine, what does Margaret know?" Catherine's lips moved again, barely audible. "The letters." Thomas's face paled instantly. "What letters?" Before anyone could press further, Catherine's body convulsed violently, her back arching against the bed, a strangled scream tearing from her throat. Whitaker grabbed her shoulders, forcing her down as he shouted, "Abigail, fetch more cold cloths. Thomas, hold her steady." Abigail rushed to the basin while Thomas pressed his weight gently on Catherine's arms, his entire body trembling. Margaret stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the young bride, her face as white as the bedsheets. Whitaker worked frantically, forcing a small dose of tincture between Catherine's lips. "Stay with me, Catherine," he whispered urgently. "Don't you dare leave this room." Minutes passed in agonizing silence until, finally, Catherine's breathing began to steady again, her body relaxing against the mattress. Whitaker exhaled shakily, wiping his forehead. "She's holding on," he said softly. For now, later. That night, Whitaker sat alone in the study, the ornate vial placed carefully on the desk before him. Outside, lightning illuminated the room in fleeting flashes as he pored over notes, trying to unravel the last threads of truth. Abigail entered, quietly, carrying a small bundle of letters tied together with frayed ribbon. Her hands trembled as she set them down on the desk. "I found these," she whispered, "in Catherine's belongings, hidden beneath the lining of her trunk." Whitaker untied the bundle, his eyes scanning the delicate handwriting. His face grew pale as he read line after line. "They're not from Catherine," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "They're to Catherine." Abigail frowned, confused. "What do they say?" Whitaker looked up slowly, his expression grim. "They're from someone in Hartford. Someone warning her not to marry Thomas. Someone who knew Margaret." Before Abigail could respond, the study door creaked open and Thomas stepped inside. "What is it?" he demanded. Whitaker hesitated, holding up the letters. "These might explain everything," he said softly, "but you're not going to like the truth." The storm raged louder outside, as though the heavens themselves anticipated what was coming. The storm raged mercilessly outside, wind screaming against the windows, as if the heavens themselves warned the Chamberlain estate of what was to come. Thunder cracked like cannon fire, shaking the very foundations of the house. Inside, the air was heavy with tension, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Catherine stirred faintly in her bed, her fragile breaths shallow and uneven. Her skin glistened with cold sweat, and the soft lamplight made her appear ghostly, as if she existed halfway between this world and the next. Abigail sat beside her, holding her hand tightly, whispering broken prayers under her breath. Thomas stood at the foot of the bed, his face pale, his eyes sunken, watching the woman he loved drift further from him. He looked shattered, like a man lost in his own home. Dr. Whitaker hovered nearby, mixing a final dose of his antidote. His hands shook slightly, not from lack of skill but from fear. Fear that even this last attempt might fail. And then Margaret entered. She moved like a shadow, her dark silk gown whispering softly as she crossed the threshold, her expression composed yet strangely hollow. She paused just inside the door, surveying the room. Catherine pale and fading, Thomas tense and broken, Abigail rigid with anger, and Whitaker silent but calculating. Thomas turned sharply, his voice raw and hoarse. "Why are you here?" Margaret met his gaze steadily, her tone unnervingly calm. "Because it's time you heard the truth." Thomas's jaw clenched. "The truth? The truth is Catherine is dying, and it's because of you." But Margaret didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped further into the room, stopping at the foot of the bed, her hands clasped tightly together. "You all think you know what happened," she said softly, her voice almost gentle. "But none of you understand why." Whitaker frowned, his voice low and cold. "Then enlighten us." Margaret drew in a slow, steady breath. "I didn't want Catherine dead," she began, her tone unwavering. "I wanted her gone." Thomas's entire body went rigid, his knuckles white as his fists clenched at his sides. "Gone?" he whispered dangerously. Margaret nodded slowly. "She isn't who she claims to be, Thomas. I tried to warn you, but you wouldn't listen." Abigail rose from the bedside, her voice sharp and trembling. "This again, more lies to protect yourself." Margaret turned on her, her eyes flashing. "Lies? The letters tell the truth." Whitaker straightened, holding up the small bundle of letters Abigail had discovered earlier. "These?" he asked carefully. "You knew about these?" Margaret hesitated only for a moment before nodding once. "I wrote them." The room went still. Thomas stared at her, his voice breaking. You sent those warnings? I was protecting you, Margaret said, her voice soft but urgent. I discovered who she really was, who her family was. Catherine Whitmore doesn't exist. She is the daughter of Samuel Byrne. Whitaker's brow furrowed deeply. Byrne? The Byrne family from Hartford? Margaret nodded. Yes. Samuel Byrne was a debtor, a thief, and a man who swindled half this town. He ruined families, Thomas. He destroyed lives. When he fled Hartford, he left behind chaos. And a daughter. She came back under a new name. She came for our fortune. Abigail shook her head furiously, clutching Catherine's hand tighter. No, that's not true. Catherine loves Thomas. Margaret's voice sharpened, cold as steel. Love doesn't hide its name. Thomas staggered back, his mind reeling. His gaze fell to Catherine, pale and fragile on the bed, her eyelids fluttering weakly as though she were trapped between worlds. Catherine, he whispered hoarsely. Tell me it isn't true. Slowly, painfully, Catherine's lips parted. Her voice was faint, broken, but clear enough to cut through the silence. My name, she breathed, is Catherine Byrne. The words hit Thomas like a blade through his chest. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, as if vindicated, then turned sharply toward Whitaker. Do you see now? This isn't about hatred. It's about protecting my son, our name, our legacy. I couldn't let him marry a Byrne. Whitaker stepped forward slowly, his face hard, his tone sharper than ever. And so you poisoned her? Margaret's composure faltered for the first time. I gave her something to unsettle her, to scare her, to make her leave. I never intended to kill her. Abigail let out a choked sob, her voice trembling with fury. You're a liar. You watched her suffer and said nothing. Margaret's expression cracked, and for the first time tears welled faintly in her eyes. I didn't know it would go this far, she whispered. Thomas stared at his mother, his breath shallow, his world collapsing around him. You destroyed everything, he said softly, his voice breaking. Suddenly, Dr. Whitaker straightened, his eyes narrowing at the ornate vial on the table. He picked it up, swirling the liquid gently, his expression darkening. This isn't atropine, he murmured. Everyone froze. Whitaker set the vial down carefully, his gaze scanning Catherine's frail form, the fevered flush of her cheeks, the violent spasms that racked her body earlier. Slowly, realization dawned in his eyes, horror blooming behind them. It's not the poison that's killing her, he whispered. It's the antidote. Abigail gasped sharply, her hand flying to her mouth. What? Whitaker turned to Margaret, his voice low and furious. What did you give her? Margaret's lips trembled. It was supposed to be harmless, just a tincture. I bought it from a traveling apothecary. He said it would cause sickness, nothing more. Whitaker shook his head violently. No, that tincture contained foxglove extract. It reacts violently with atropine. The two combined are lethal. Margaret staggered backward, her hand flying to her chest, her face pale with shock. I didn't know. Thomas's entire body shook as he stared between Whitaker and his mother. You've killed her, he whispered, his voice hollow. No, Whitaker snapped sharply, his eyes blazing. Not yet. He grabbed his satchel, pulling out a small glass syringe and a dark green vial of antidote. There's one chance left, but it's dangerous. If her heart doesn't hold, this will stop it entirely. Thomas grabbed Catherine's hand tightly, lowering his forehead against it. Do it, he whispered. Please, save her. Whitaker drew a deep breath, steadied his hands, and injected the antidote into Catherine's arm. For a long, harrowing moment, nothing happened. The storm outside howled louder, thunder splitting the night apart, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Then Catherine gasped violently, her chest heaving as her eyes shot open. She let out a cry, sharp and ragged, her body trembling uncontrollably. Abigail clutched her shoulders, whispering frantic reassurances as Whitaker checked her pulse with trembling fingers. Finally, he exhaled sharply, relief flooding his face. "She's stable," he said softly. "For now." Thomas broke down, his head in his hands, tears streaming freely down his face. Margaret stood frozen near the door, her body shaking, her lips parting as though to speak. But no words came. For the first time in her life, she looked small. Catherine turned her head slowly, her weak gaze finding Margaret. Her voice was faint, but the venom in it was unmistakable. "You tried to break me," she whispered, "but you've broken yourself." Margaret said nothing. She simply turned and left the room, her footsteps echoing down the corridor until they faded into silence. Outside, the storm began to quiet, but inside the Chamberlain estate, nothing would ever be the same. Thomas sat beside Catherine's bed, holding her hand, knowing the wounds Margaret left would never truly heal. Dr. Whitaker closed the ornate vial, sealing it away as evidence of everything that had been lost. And deep in the shadows of the hallway, Margaret stood alone, staring at the family portrait, hanging on the wall, her hand trembling, her reflection fractured in the glass. For the first time, she realized the truth she had fought so hard to deny. She hadn't saved her family, she had destroyed it.